Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah, and I am happy to be with you today talking about bad writing advice. I am sure that we are similar people in that we have looked up writing advice or we've had classes in which someone gives us writing advice. And so today I'm going to delve into um, really common writing advice and why a lot of it is garbage. That sounds unfair probably, and I'm not the most famous advice giver. I am neither strunk nor white. I am not a famous poet or whatever. But I do teach and I do write, and I have noticed that a lot of writing advice is either really vague or really snobby, and a lot of it can be ignored or really, really, really needs to be clarified. Um, Also, a lot of this advice, I feel like we get into it and we're like, I'm going to be a better writer. I'm going to be a more consistent writer. I'm going to whatever. And so we take this advice and we take it really seriously, which can be really toxic. And something I say a lot, it can lead to paralysis if you take it too seriously because there's all this pressure involved. Um, Also, a lot of advice can be toxic if you take it while you're writing. I think I had an itch on my foot. I think most writing advice is actually more relevant to editing, and that's something we don't talk about when we talk about writing advice, when we say things like, always use this voice or avoid using this kind of word. That shouldn't come into play in your rough draft, in the moment that you're doing the act of writing. So leave most advice for editing. If you take nothing else away from this, I want you to leave most writing advice for the editing process. And editing can be a lot of things. I'm not going to get into that today, but that's an important one. I would even say if if you're going to wait on taking a lot of the advice, save it for the second round of edits at least. You don't you don't want to start cutting from your piece. And all of the advice I'm going to address today is going to be genreless. So there's a lot of advice out there specific to writing short stories, specific to writing novels, specific to writing poetry, specific to nonfiction, specific to journalism. This is all going to be across the board stuff. But back to what I was saying. Wait until a later draft to start really digging into the writing advice that people give. You don't want to just call or cut immediately from your piece. Once if you're like me, I write by hand and then you type. You have to type. And definitely the typing is sort of an editing process. You see mistakes that you've made or you want to change wording a little bit, but don't cut anything yet. Don't cut anything until at least the second round of edits, because the piece is going to grow into itself throughout revisions. And if you don't hate something and you're just cutting it because there's some writing advice that said so, leave it at least for one round of edits. Um, it deserves that if it was important enough to get out, to get down on paper. Also, keep revision records. This is really common advice and I think really important. I didn't used to do this, and I don't regret it because I started doing it once I started really caring about what I was writing, or at least I don't know. I was relatively young when I started keeping revision records, and some of the older stuff, the revision records I have are on paper. I know for um, older writers who didn't grow up with a computer, uh, a lot of them have full files of drafts as they changed, and that's awesome. Takes up space, but other than that, I think it's really cool. What I do is just, you know, change the file name or make a copy and change the file name. Sometimes, depending on what word processing program you use, changing the file name makes a whole new document. Sometimes you need to copy it and then change the file name. Usually I just date it or write which draft number it is. But the reason for that is you never know what you might want to delete and then get back, or if there's just this really beautiful phrase you used and it doesn't fit the piece for whatever reason, you might want to use it later. And we'll have a whole video on that eventually. I've been teasing it for a while, on how to scan old work for usable content. It's a tough one and I don't really want to share my crappy writing, but I will for you. So most importantly, before I dig into specific pieces of advice that I hate, you are the foremost writer, the foremost expert on your writing. So you know your voice. And if you don't know your voice, you know your intentions, you know yourself, you know the piece better than anybody else does. You are its creator, you are its God. And at the end of the day, you are the expert who makes the decisions. So if everybody worships this one piece of advice, if even you historically have really respected this piece of advice, but it doesn't work for this piece, you're the person who can make that call. Don't trust an expert to know your work better than you. They can't. And for what it's worth, a lot of us experiment a lot in our writing, and maybe that experiment involves like changing tense a lot or changing format a lot. And all the writing advice out there says, I'll get to this one. It says, don't use passive voice, but that's part of like your narrative or your experiment. Obviously throw that advice aside, even if that's really good advice most of the time. You know your work and you need to accept that you are the expert in the room. That's a phrase I use sometimes. I'm not sure if I've used it here. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. But the expert in the room is just, every room, you may not have a writing professor or a medical doctor in the room, but there's someone in the room who knows best. Currently, I am the only person in this room, so I'm an expert on all things. But if I say the expert in the room, that's what it means. And of course, if the topic is you're the writer, you're the expert on your own writing, always. That said, it's nice to have an editor friend who knows you really well, but they still don't know they still don't know the writing. You wrote it, everything there is to know about it. Having a friend who knows you well can definitely help you in the editing process, but your brain, your heart is what made this. So you're the expert. For example, I'm working really hard on this piece that I've been working on for years, if I'm honest, and I really want it to be done. I want to enter it in a contest. And so I've been sending it to writers, editors that I love and respect, that I know in real life. Not like 70 people, like 4. And more than one person gave me the same advice, which was to cut these 2 elements of this piece. I'm not going to go into the details. But those are the only 2 elements of the piece that I'm really married to. Like I said, I do a lot of experimenting. I do a lot of playing with style and form in my work. So that was really the cornerstone. These 2 elements are really the cornerstone of the piece. And I was advised by more than one person, I'm not sure if it was 2 or 3, to cut these 2 things. And those are the only things that I really want to stay in the piece. So knowing myself, knowing my writing, knowing my intention, I'm able to ignore that advice. I explained to one of them that like, that's, what I want to be, maybe not the grounding element, but the cornerstone of the piece. And that person was like, oh, totally get it. Don't know how to help you, but I get it. And if the editor doesn't respect that, then, or the reader doesn't respect that, then they're not the reader or editor for you, honestly. Okay, let's dig into the meat and potatoes. I didn't go into huge huge depth here. For one thing, your time is limited. For another, so is mine. Um, there's tons of advice out there that can be taken with a grain of salt. I'm sure I'll repeat this at the end. And trust you at the end of the day. But also really, really interrogate the advice that you're getting. I don't have a list of the 100 most frequently given pieces of writing advice from which I can, decide which ones suck and then present it to you. So these are just, I don't know, like 10 really common ones, but there's more out there and you can interrogate it. You can hit up a friend, you can hit me up and say, hey, what do you think of this piece of writing advice? Okay, so the first one, have something to say. I hate it. For so many reasons. Like saying that involves such ego, I think. Just being like, if you're going to write, you really need to have something to say. Like, who are you to tell me whether or not I have something to say? It's daunting, it's rude, and it ignores that many of us write out of compulsion. Many of us write because we're looking to learn about ourselves. Many of us write. I quoted this silly quote last week, I think, but there's that famous quote. I think it's Didion that says, "I write to learn what I'm thinking." That's not really why I write. That's maybe why I journal. But you don't have to be writing because you have a thesis. Like you don't have to be writing because you have a specific story in mind. That's just not fair. And it's similar to the advice, write what you know. And I would say advice probably isn't great if the opposite of the advice is also advice that's given. It's okay advice. It's not bad advice to write what you know. But for writing experiments, for writing prompts, for writing in general, a lot of the times we also say, specifically write what you don't know. Put yourself in someone else's shoes. Write in a world that doesn't exist. I once wrote a story about a civilization that lives inside of carpet. And the point of that, it was a prompt in art school to write, I don't know, a fantasy setting or a non-real setting. And they give us like 4 words, and I'm guessing this is where this story came from, because mostly what's left in my head is visuals of like the little spirals of fabric of carpet being like tree tall, and like everywhere, not spaced out. But a lot of the time in that art school, they would just give us like 6 words, and we had to write based on that. And maybe there was another element to write a dream or a dream setting or whatever. Anyway, I know nothing about creatures that live in carpet, nor do I want to, for that matter. But if a piece of advice can be given as the opposite of a piece of advice, maybe it's no steadfast rule. So write what you know is fine, but not a universal, right? Because you also sometimes write what you don't know. And this goes hand in hand with have something to say. Like that's a very arrogant rule, if you ask me. It assumes that I myself, as the rule giver, have something to say, and if you do not, you are not worthy of writing. Like, buzz off. Like that's not okay. There should be no gatekeeping involved in making art, and that's what that is. So whether or not you feel like you have something to say, you are allowed to write. Ignore that. Just wipe that away. Let me see if I have any other notes on that particular subject. Oh yeah, that one in particular is paralyzing and can stop us from writing altogether, potentially. It's not generative, it's not productive, it's mostly rude. Any rule, and I'm on to my next rule that I'm crapping on. Any rule that dictates word, sentence, or paragraph length is garbage. Partially, I think this is usually genre specific advice, but I still think that is crappy. You know, the dictates of word length, paragraph length, sentence length, line length. When I say that's genre specific advice, I think that there would be specific advice for different genres on that, and I say scrap them all. Unless you're working with a specific meter, your word and line length are your business alone. Part of that is because style is style. The context of subject, the context of the rest of the piece matter a lot based on are what you should base your word, sentence, paragraph, line length on. You know the piece, you know the rest of the piece. Advice I've seen out there on the internet and in books a lot is like, keep your words short and keep your sentences short. And like, I know I bring up a few dead white men a lot in my writing talks, but like, what if Hemingway kept his sentences short? Like, there would just be no Hemingway. Similarly, what if Faulkner kept his words short? There's this really fun exchange that I see a lot too, between Hemingway and Faulkner talking about each other. Faulkner said Hemingway clearly has never used a dictionary while writing, and then this, I'm paraphrasing, and then Hemingway said back, poor Faulkner thinks that big feelings come from big words. So these are two contemporary writers who had just totally opposite styles and ideas about what words to choose, and they're both freaking fabulous. Anyone who comes at Hemingway or Faulkner and says like they write bad sentences is just lying. But you don't have to write Hemingway sentences and you don't have to write Faulkner sentences. That's the point here. Any rule that dictates the length or size of a sentence, paragraph, word, line, piece is bad advice. What I wrote down in my notes here is all caps, you don't know me. And that's the gist of my problem with this advice. You don't know me when you're giving me this advice. You don't know my writing. You don't know my style. You don't know the cultural context in which I'm writing. You don't know the genre in which I'm writing. You don't know my experiments or experience. But also it assumes so much about the writer, about the audience, about the intention. You know, if I think probably Hemingway fancied himself a man of the people, I find him really difficult to read. I love him. He is incredibly difficult to read. But he probably thought that with that response, right, big feelings don't come from big words. He probably thought he was being accessible by writing language without having to look up words. And that's your prerogative as a writer. You know your intention. And I also give the advice a lot, like, don't think about the audience until you've written. Like, you need to write the thing first. There's no audience if there's no art. But again, in editing, which is where this advice would come into play, right? You've already written and you have seen this advice that you should keep your sentences short and your words short. And then you start cutting or using a thesaurus to make shorter words. First of all, you don't need a thesaurus unless you're being really, really repetitive, and you just keep saying the word rain over and over again. Then, like, okay, use a thesaurus and figure out other words for rain. But generally, trust your own writing, trust your style, trust writer you to be at least as strong as editor you. You know what audience you're going for. So like maybe you used the word esoteric and you're writing for third graders. Okay. Maybe you chop up esoteric and you say things only some people understand. Totally. Change it. Use smaller words. But I don't know that as the person giving you advice on the internet or in a book. So Disregard anything that dictates the length or size of your work. Unless it's like a contest, obviously. Don't write 12 pages when you're only allowed to submit 5, but like also probably send in work you've already written. It's all complicated. That's kind of the point. Context matters so much to writing advice. I honestly, I just caught my reflection. I was making a crazy face. I honestly don't know who that advice is for, and usually it's about shortening words and sentences. Maybe the assumption is that we're all really long-winded. But again, I say that that's what the editing process is for. If you use too many words, if you ramble, like you're going to cut that anyway, or your editor will catch it, if it doesn't work. Maybe you're writing some wonderfully large tome and rambling is the point because of whatever it is that you're doing. You're the expert here. This advice is garbage because you know better. Okay, here's advice that I talk about a lot because I think that it is so dangerous. We see this advice a lot, to write every morning, or alternatively, write every day, or write at the same time every day, or write in the exact same setting every day. The advice is generally have a very specific writing routine, and here's what it should be. As someone who has never, ever written first thing in the morning, I am immediately uncomfortable with write first thing in the morning advice. It's just never going to work for me. So I had to really interrogate that advice. And following that advice, say I'm looking for writing advice on the writing practice, specifically outside of that, the advice always seems to be you need to follow the exact same routine in the exact same place every day. And that's not bad advice inherently on its own. Having a routine sets you up for success in a lot of ways. Routines are super helpful just to creating habits. But with art in particular, there's something really special about changing up your routine, changing your setting, changing your format. In this context, when I say format, I mean you're usually a computer writer, but you're going to change it up and write by hand. The same goes for setting. I personally, granted, I don't always base my advice to you on my own experience, but I also think that my taking issue with things might be a good example. So generally speaking, when I give you advice, it's something I've seen a lot, something I've experienced a lot, something I've talked a lot about with other writers and artists. So as writers, we have the distinct privilege of having a mobile craft. I've mentioned before, my sister's a painter, and you can't just take that everywhere with you. Like maybe you've got a little portable watercolor set that you can fit in your bag. Or if you're not a watercolor artist, it's really hard to travel with oil paints or sculpting clay. So that's a distinct privilege that we have over basically all other art forms. Maybe not drawing, maybe not most music is not so mobile, partially because you make noise. If you're a singer, you can probably sing anywhere, but only physically, right? Not every setting is set up for practicing singing. And there's songwriting, which is writing, so it's mobile, except when you need to physically check out how it sounds. Again, I'm not a musician, so it's a poor example. But the point is, I I've rambled a little bit on how privileged we are as writers to have a mobile craft. And to get back to the point. Um, and changing up the routine because we can be mobile, can be really generative. Um, Routine is totally useful. I already said that. But changing it up can be more useful. Um, I I write by hand, and I'm very, very grateful that that's the practice that I have, because for one thing, the typing process is a whole new process. But for another, it's extra mobile, which means that I'm never trapped. Um, if I have a compulsion to write, which number one, if you're always only writing first thing in the morning and you get a great idea or inspiration, compulsion later in the day, do you just not write? This is kind of a serious question. I would, if I were answering, I would say no, obviously I would write. But somebody recently told me, shout out Terry, that she read writing advice from, I want to say Hemingway. It's Hemingway Day. I don't know. I'd never seen this advice before. No, it wasn't Terry. It was Ashley. Shout out Ashley. That he would write until he got to a really exciting part and then stop, so that he would know where to pick up again the next day. Um, Dear God, I would never tell anyone to stop while they were at an exciting part of their writing. Uh, if the writing is coming, right. If you need to take a day off because you wrote all of the active things that were exciting that were coming to you, take a day off. Um, Granted, that's also questionable advice, because where do you stop, right? If you don't write every day, how do you keep up with the writing practice? I've talked about that in other videos. um, so any prescriptive hard and fast rules about when and where to write, I would also ignore. I think it's useful, of course, to create a routine, to make it a daily practice, but hard and fast rules about when and where to write ignore inspiration, ignore how generative change can be just in location, or in, you know, using your hand, using your pen and notebook instead of your computer. Um, or, maybe you're feeling whimsical, you use a typewriter or a whiteboard. All of that stuff can be really generative. Um, the idea of mourning is something that people justify by saying, the day hasn't gotten into you yet, hasn't infected you or affected you. Um, I've never had that problem. Like, yes, it happens sometimes that I'm too stressed at the end of the day, or too much happened that day, and I'm just not in the right state of mind to be writing. Um, but I think it's presumptuous to assume that I'm just fine in the morning, or that I'm a blank slate in the morning, or that a blank slate is a better writer than a not blank slate. You know, um, I don't know how the rest of the day is going to go. I have guesses based on experience, right? But I wake up in the morning and I'm a blank slate maybe, and that's the best time that day for me to write. But I don't know that when I wake up. I don't know that something bad or stressful or big is going to happen later in the day. And I also don't know that that's going to be the best time of day. Maybe something happens during that day and I feel like I'm all written out, and then I get inspiration, but I'm too tired. Like, it's very presumptuous. So write whenever works best for you, and ignore anything that's prescriptive, hard and fast. Um, because it ignores all of the beautiful opportunities that may come your way that are more generative than sticking to a routine. Also, it can be a paralyzing pressure if you skip it. If, one day or 2 days it doesn't work out, and then you just feel bad about yourself. Any hard and fast rule, anything really, really prescriptive and specific, I would ignore outright. Um, let's move on. The next rule I've got here to talk about is show, don't tell. And I think that's actually excellent advice most of the time, but it's really vague. And if you don't know the lingo, It's terrible. There's a lot about writing that is classist, or at least has a lot of barriers to access, and one of those things is the language. Um, when we say show don't tell, we're assuming that the person hearing this advice knows what we mean, and that's not helpful if you don't know what it means. And I would also say, if you've heard it enough, you might forget what it means. It just becomes sounds. So I'll get into it a little bit, into some details about what it means. Um, Telling, of course, is literally explaining what someone is experiencing, saying something like, she was sad thinking about the distance. And sometimes that's the sentence you want and need. Um, but the idea is that showing is more effective for conveying feeling to the audience. Um, so that would be, her eyes overflowed, her body sank as the road stretched out and the house turned into a dot and then nothing. Right. So now I have the physical image of her crying and her body sinking, growing smaller, sagging. I just wrote these sentences as examples. I'm not promising that they're quality sentences, but you know, one is telling me something and one is showing me the same thing the other told me. Um, they're both words, so I think that they both are telling. But one is telling using descriptive language and verbs, which is more effective if what you want to do is convey emotion and or make your audience feel things. If you need to distance, then telling is better, right? If you want your narrator or your character or whatever to have some numbness, some distance from what's going on, then telling is going to be better for your piece. But I will say with characters specifically, character development is definitely better than telling or trying to get it all out at once in the early pages. We see this a lot on TV shows in pilots. I'm going to use an example of a show I really, really love, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. In the first episode, they use a pretty clever advice where one character is telling another character little tiny bios to give him an idea of the other characters. And there's this one that just drives me nuts. I mean, the whole thing I think it's a nice device for a pilot for a 30-minute sitcom. But they use this one character. Her name is Amy. The show's about a bunch of cops, and it's a comedy. And they get a new captain. They get a new boss in the first episode. So they use one character to just set up the show and say, "Hey, here's this person. Here's this person. Here's this person," and it's clever. But they, for this one character, her name is Amy. He says she has 8 brothers and she's the only girl, and therefore she's super competitive. And my God, if that's how you describe a character, I don't know, you're being lazy. And then the scene that they give as an example is her using a bunch of hot sauce because someone told her not to. I think this is doing a disservice to this Amy character, who turns out to be, competitive, yes, but that's like not the major part of her character. And granted, TV shows take a lot of time, so there's a lot of change in character and in writing. Um, but character development over time is much more effective than you telling me she has, I have no idea how many brothers. She has several brothers and she's the only girl, and therefore she's trying to prove herself all the time. It's going to mean a lot more to me as your audience to get to know the character rather than just be told about them. And that's where showing can be so much better than telling. Again, The meat and potatoes of it is just straight out saying a couple words in a sentence that the character is sad, or showing me she's crying, showing me that her body is slumping, showing me that there is a physical distance. Again, unless you want distance from the emotion, from the experience, from the narrator. Another piece of advice, this one comes out with lots of different language, that we see different words for this particular piece of advice often, but it's a use of filler words, use of fluff words, and that's, again, not bad advice, except it's so vague. There are writers who have pet peeve words, which is useful or not. Again, all of this has to do with your style at the end of the day and your intentions. So that's a big reason to take all advice with a grain of salt. But fluff words usually refer to adjectives or adverbs, specifically vague ones. So like the word quite, the word very, the word words like that are super vague, and those are common pet peeve words. I would say quite is a word that I learned to hate over time because it doesn't really mean anything. Like the word very or the word really, we know what that means. That means like a lot. Quite doesn't. You could say quite a lot or quite little, and I digress. Usually when people say fluff words or filler words, they mean adjectives or adverbs. And the replacement that they suggest, and this is solid advice, is to use a verb instead. And this is advice that you want to save for editing. So if you want to say that, like, I ran so quickly through the woods, I ran very quickly through the woods, it might be more effective to say so that's very quickly, a filler word and an adverb. It might be more effective to say I tore through the woods, right? Tore is a verb. The verb tore is replacing the word run. And it is a bigger word, a more active word, a more visceral word than quickly or than run. Again, this is useful advice, except that it's so vague and definitely should be saved for editing. Your first draft can be whatever your first draft is. Here's a piece of advice that's really fun and weird. Some famous person along the way said to never use any word about dialogue other than the word said. Meaning, if someone asks a question, you don't say they asked. If someone yells, you don't say they exclaimed. Sure, questioned, replied, exclaimed, asked, those are trite. They're boring. But is said the only word you want to use? And also, do you want to just keep repeating said? I think the point here is that if you have a question mark at the end of this sentence, then it's clear it's a question. A lot of the times when we see dialogue, it's, two people speaking and they go back and forth. So you need nothing for at least a little bit. You want to add, their name or whatever, some descriptions in intermittently so that you don't get lost in who's speaking. But that's an option, right? Using nothing. Or verbs. Verbs are really fun. When you're in some heavy dialogue area and you've got, 3, 4, 5 lines of back and forth with no said, no he said, no they said, no she said. But verbs are your best friend in this situation, right? You can say, sure, he allowed, but, or you think his word stabbed at the other person he's talking to. Yes, he looked away. Those are giving me context for the situation. You're reminding me that these are physical entities that are talking. Tomorrow she spat. This gives me energy from the conversation. I already said, adds context, and it shows me their moods without, like, she moaned, she cried, she questioned, she exclaimed. You're giving me so much more of the scene when you add verbs to the dialogue. Saying to the advice to only ever use the word said is, it's vague. But it also either assumes that you know, like, the rest of the idea behind that, or it gets really repetitive and it's just bad advice. um, Here's another one. I give this advice sometimes, and it is vague and bad without context, which is to put the piece away. Sometimes we say that, sometimes we say shelve it, sometimes we say put it in a drawer. I often wonder if people are literally putting their work in drawers. I don't have a lot of drawers in my life, so that's interesting to me. You see drawers here, but they're very small drawers. The only problem with that advice, right, is that it needs to come with a deadline. I have a piece I need to take a break from because I've been staring at it for like a week without stopping. If I'm working on writing, I'm working on this piece and I'm just staring at it. And that's not useful. That's just making me angry. So it is useful to put it away. But this piece in particular, I put away for a year once. I'm not working on it. That space isn't necessarily going to do anything for me. I may have forgotten the point. Hopefully I didn't. And if I did, I still think I know what I'm doing with it. So the advice there is set a deadline. Maybe a week isn't long enough, but set a deadline for a week, set an alarm, put a sticky note somewhere, whatever your life is. I think most people use phones at this point, but I do so much analog that, I'm not going to judge. Give yourself a week, say, put the note on your calendar or whatever, check back next Thursday on this piece. And if that's not enough time, you'll know, and you can set another week or you can set a month, but you can't just shelve a piece or put a piece aside and not come back to it. So that's why that's bad advice. And if your intention is to come back to it, you should probably still have some follow-up. Like you can intend all day and totally forget about something, or think about it and get frustrated, and therefore just keep ignoring it for longer and longer. So I would say anytime you're going to take that advice and shelve a piece, give yourself a solid deadline on that. And I don't care when. If you think you need a month, if you think you need a year away from this piece, that's on you. But you need to come back to it, and you need to be accountable to yourself and to the deadline that you give yourself. Again, if you're giving yourself a week, which is my most common thing, and you come back to it a week later and that's not enough time, give yourself another week. That's fine. But you have to come back to it or it's pointless. Okay, here's another piece of advice that we see a lot that drives me crazy. It's never use a passive voice. And I think that started in nonfiction, like journalism or like papers that you write. But it's not universal advice. It just isn't. Granted, the point of, all right, here's the first thing. This is another grammar thing. This is another gatekeeper thing. It's okay to not know what that means. There's a lot of gatekeepery stuff in writing. Most predominantly grammar and the language we use when we talk about writing. It's classist. You don't have to know all of these words to be a writer, and you don't have to know what passive voice is to be a writer, and you don't have to know, there was something I said earlier about like adverbs or fluff words. You can be a writer without any of this, without any education. So I'm going to define the term, which is an important thing to do. Passive voice is, and again, I'm going to say more grammar words and I'll define them again. Passive voice is when the subject receives the action of the sentence. So the subject is usually a person, but maybe you've written an entire piece about a pen. I just looked around for something. So whatever the subject is, it's the thing the sentence is about, usually a person. And then, so in a, I already have said everything wrong. The subject of a sentence is usually a person. It's the thing that the sentence is about. But in passive voice, the object receives the action. And the object is not usually the subject. The object is a thing. And the action is the thing that's happening. So often sentences have subjects and objects. Object changes a lot based on what the sentence. There's a lot of nitty-gritty grammar things about objects in sentences. But passive voice usually involves the verb to be. So be, is, was, am. This is hard. Yeah, I think that's it. Is, was, am, be. Passive voice is past tense, so already happened. So to write a passive sentence, I would say the ball was thrown. The ball then is the object receiving the action. The ball is the object, the action is throw. Was here is the word to be. So though the ball was thrown by Jim, the ball is now the subject of the sentence, even though Jim is the person who probably the story is about, or poem or whatever. And the reason people don't like the passive voice is because it takes out a lot of emotion. It often is wordier. So rather than Jim threw the ball, we're saying the ball was thrown by Jim. And if you want fewer words, then that's not the most effective sentence. It takes attention away from Jim, the thrower. And I think people just don't like how it sounds. I use passive voice a lot. Granted, I'm, again, not necessarily a perfect role model of how to write. But my pieces that use passive voice are intentionally distanced. There's, I like a certain amount of numbness, of emotionlessness from my narrator in my pieces that use this. So that's intentional and that's stylistic. And even if it's not intentional, it is stylistic, and it can be edited later. Yeah. So the most important thing with all of this advice is you know your writing, you know what style you're going for, and context matters. So while if I'm writing a piece that happened in past tense and is about Jim, then saying Jim threw the ball is going to be better than the ball was thrown by Jim. Sure. It moves the piece along faster. It is more to the point. The story is about Jim, not the ball. And even so, if the story is about the ball, then saying the I'm messing up now. Saying Jim threw the ball is still faster, is still more active than the ball was thrown by Jim. The ball is probably going to be capitalized in this sentence because the ball then is the character. Yeah, anytime you get into like grammar rules about your writing, things get confusing. They get convoluted because you have to go into a lot of, when you interrogate something like that, when you ask the questions, you get into a lot of just like, these are the rules things, and you get into a lot of grammar language, which adds to the confusion, I think. I have a pretty good grasp of grammar and grammar rules, but I think that abiding by them or making them rules, hard and fast rules, is gatekeeping and is classist. But also, a lot of them are arbitrary or old-timey, and like once you start using the language of grammar, it gets confusing. And like you saw me, I got tongue-tied and stumbled over the words I was trying to say because it's all these little technical words. I'm gonna close up the video here in just a moment, but the thing I want you to take away from this is to trust yourself and trust your writing and save the rules for the editing process. Don't let anything get between you and the writing when you're doing the writing, unless it's an emergency. I am reading a book on writing right now, and it's fantastic. And it does something which I'm very fond of because, well, you'll see. It wants students of writing to write by hand with a pen and paper. This, of course, doesn't apply to folks who cannot. There are a lot of reasons that that's difficult for a lot of people, and we don't want this advice to be ableist, of course. But that's what I'm going to challenge you with today. We're not there yet. I'll get into the free write in a moment. But now I'm going to tell you what's up at the Midwest Writing Center, then we'll do the free write. I want to thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope that this helps you to write more light in your life. There are so many more rules out there that we can disregard or interrogate to itty bitty pieces until they work for us or until they make sense. And I encourage you to do that. If you see a writing rule, like ask why that's a rule or advice. Ask who would give that advice, ask why they would give that advice, ask really, will that work for you? I know that's also a lot of what I do. I give writing advice in these videos. My point is always to make you write more light into your life. My hope is always for a generative outcome, but it's also important to remember that that art is not a product. While, we end up with something physical in our hands a lot of the time, art is not a product. We live in a product-based world where the consumption of things is, the creation and consumption of things is often what we're told the point is. And art is not a product in that way. Art must be as much about process as it is about end goal, or we will lose a lot of the art to it. So be careful with yourself, be careful with your heart when you're making art. Don't get bogged down by an end result or productivity. The goal is that art, the creation of art, makes your life better. And I would say the more people making art, whether or not it's for public consumption, the better our world is going to be. Art is good for the world. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, and thank you so much for listening, and thank you for questioning and disregarding the rules and advice that people give you who don't know you and don't know your writing and don't care to foster more creation from you. That should always be the goal. If you're sharing your work with someone or looking for advice, it should always be with the intention of fostering further creation. So what's up at the Midwest Writing Center? I'll be less emotional now. We have the bespoke poetry still going on. The deadline for that to request custom made poetry, bespoke means custom made, is February 28th. The deadline is like today or yesterday if you want something for Valentine's Day, because we've got a 5-day turnaround. We cannot ask our poets to create something in 10 minutes, especially when we're trying to put so much thought into it. We're going to ask you a lot of questions. You're going to communicate with your poet, and it makes a really, really excellent gift. It's these poets are really, really talented. They really understand language. They really understand emotion, and they work really hard to understand your intentions for the poem that you want written. We also have the additional option that you have it typed on. This is a mistake draft I made. Typed on homemade paper, maybe cut into a heart, for so that you do have that end product to hold in your hand. The results have turned out just so beautifully. We've got 8 really fantastic poets on this, and I'm pretty critical. I think poetry is either excellent or not, and so when I'm saying that this is excellent, I mean it. We also have the Iron Pen contest coming up at the end of this month. It is almost mid-February right now, so everything's coming up fast. So Iron Pen is a 24-hour contest. It starts 5 p.m. on Friday the 26th. Yes, 5 p.m. Friday the 26th, and we'll make the prompt public 5 p.m. on the dot on our website, on our social media, in your inbox if you have signed up, and on our voicemail. It is $10 to register. You can register as many times as you want. You can do it in every single category. We do fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. $10 to register. Each registration gives you a chance to win full tuition to the Collins Writers Conference in the summer. I can tell you, without going into detail, this is not the year to miss. So $10 seems like a great deal for the full tuition to this conference. And yes, so then you turn it in by 5 p.m. the next day, Saturday the 27th, and then you've written a piece. Like, worst case scenario, you did some writing, which is awesome. You can, of course, get details on bespoke poetry and on Iron Pen on our website. We also have a workshop coming up in March. I want to say the 15th. That is our journal writing workshop. That's in collaboration with NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. The, of course, local chapter, the Mississippi Valley region, is collaborating with us on this workshop with Jody Toohey and Ryan Collins. We're going to talk about why journaling is good for your health. I'm going to be a student. I'm not going to be talking. Why it's good for your creative practice and why it's good for your health, and other writing practices that are going to be good for your mental health. It's very important, and definitely a wonderful way to increase the light you write into your life. I think we have something else coming up. Oh gosh, I feel really, really silly. Local Lovers open mic is on. We were really nervous we weren't going to be able to do it this year. It's part of our Spectra poetry reading series, but we're doing an open mic. Come what you have. Come as you are, bring what you have, and participate. It doesn't have to be poetry. It can be music, jokes, prose, of course. We're going to do that online right here. And you'll email me or a comment down below, or send us a private message saying you want to sign up for the open mic. We'd like you to sign up in advance, which is, not the most open mic-y thing, but not an uncommon one. You'll sign up at the event most of the time when it's in person, and we'll give you 5 minutes to do what you do. We want you to sign up in advance so we can make sure we've got time for everybody, and so that nobody comes last minute and then we're out of room, etc. That's February 18th, 7 p.m. right here. Hit us up, however it is that you contact us, for the Zoom code if you want to be a participant and read, or if you don't have Facebook or whatever and you want to be an audience in the Zoom meeting. Totally, totally fine. Super excited about it. I have been missing our events. The Midwest Reading Center events are my bread and butter of joy in life. So I'm super, super excited. I will be there. I will be very excited to hear from everybody. So I think that concludes my updates. I have my phone, so I can set the timer on your free write. I would like you to, if possible, write by hand. That's the first thing. And if you cannot write by hand, that's totally fine. I'm going to challenge you to close your eyes while you write. Now, you, again, don't have to do that, but I want this to be a free write. I want it to be journal-y, which I know is a bit to ask, but setting the timer, sorry. I want you to write about bad writing advice. I want you to talk about advice you had to discard, or why you find one particular piece of advice really troubling or has been really difficult to stick to. And the reason for this, the reason that journaling on writing advice is useful, is it'll help you get to know what your own troubles and your own triumphs and your own perspective is on writing advice, good or bad. But especially bad, like really getting to know the things that you don't respect can be really useful and empowering for moving on and disregarding bad advice. So I'm going to set the 5 minutes. At the beginning of the timer, I'm going to throw some stuff in the comments on the video, my contact info and the event info for the stuff I mentioned. If you're dropping off now, you're not going to do the free write with us, then of course, go forward in life and write more light. If you are going to join us, thank you. I will be writing as soon as I'm done throwing those comments down. So here's 5 minutes. Let's get going. wish that didn't scare me so much. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you gained something from journaling on bad writing advice or good writing advice. And I'm really, really happy to have you with me today. As always, write more light into your life. Check out the events. Come to our open mic. Write more light.